Deja vu in Europe. Will this round of lockdowns be any different? Hi there, thanks for joining us for another Plain English lesson. I'm Jeff. JR is the producer, and this full lesson can be found at plainenglish.com/310. Coming up today, Europe goes back into lockdown as most countries scramble to impose restrictions as coronavirus cases spike. Will it be any easier this time around? The expression we review is balancing act, and we have a quote of the week. The cafes in Paris, the beaches in Spain, the beer gardens in Germany, they were buzzing with life just weeks ago as Europe appeared to have turned a corner. People were learning to live with the coronavirus and were making social distancing a part of their lives. Politicians confidently declared that, come what may, there would not be a second round of strict lockdowns like the continent experienced in March and April. This was the new normal, and Europeans were learning to live with it. Europe's low infection rate seemed to validate its sensible contact tracing programs and its cautious, well-coordinated reopening plans. The continent's generous healthcare system was working. A vaccine was in the future. The end was near. What a distant memory that seems now. France, Germany, Spain, Austria, Portugal, Britain, and others all began rolling back their reopening plans. The French Prime Minister said, "No one can consider themselves safe from this." The French President said, "We are submerged by the sudden acceleration of the virus." An advisor to the British government said, "This outbreak is now running riot across all age groups." Angela Merkel said, "This winter will be long, 4 long, difficult months." Political leaders are trying to avoid repeating the mistake of the spring, namely, waiting too long to impose restrictions on movement. But at the same time, their constituents are restless, exhausted after 7 months of restricted liberty and economic hardship. Protests have broken out across Italy, with residents pushing back against lockdowns, curfews, and closures of bars and restaurants. In Rome, police used water cannon to fight back against the protests, which they said were unauthorized. Spanish police clashed with protesters in Barcelona and surrounding towns in Catalonia. Balance that against the alarming rise in the incidence of the disease. France, Germany, and Spain all reported higher numbers of cases, deaths, and hospitalizations than at any other time since the worst of the first outbreak in the spring. The force with which the virus has returned took health and political leaders by surprise. What was a trickle of new cases during most of the summer started to increase in September and then sharply accelerated in October. Some European countries, including Poland and the Czech Republic, were spared the worst of the initial outbreak, but they are now dealing with high numbers of cases for the first time. Britain, which had lagged the continent in imposing restrictions, led the way this time as Boris Johnson announced a 4-week stay-at-home order that banned gatherings of friends and extended family even within private homes. The world's experience was that a total lockdown does slow the spread of the virus and contain hospitalizations, but that it comes at an extraordinary cost. In the initial outbreak, little was known, so political leaders were doing their best to react to the latest news as this unfamiliar disease was spreading through the population. They seized unprecedented powers to control the movements of the population: curfews, business closures, stay-at-home orders. This time, the challenge will be to process what we've learned in recent months and design policies that control the virus's impact while also limiting the economic and social damage. It is a high-stakes balancing act. If policies are too lenient, a deadly disease could overwhelm hospitals and kill a large portion of the citizenry, the nightmare scenario everyone fears. But if policies are too strict, the damage will be felt differently. Economic hardship, stunted education, mental health impacts, and political instability. Individual countries design their own policies in Europe, but they are taking a similar shape. Overnight curfews limit the ability of people to be outside during nighttime hours, often defined as 10 p.m. or even earlier. Among the countries that have announced nighttime curfews are the Czech Republic, Portugal, Spain, and Austria. Ireland and France have imposed a limit on how far citizens can go from their houses. It's 5 kilometers in Ireland and just 1 kilometer in France. Many countries are closing businesses that rely on gatherings of people. Bars and restaurants for indoor dining, entertainment venues like cinemas and theaters, and fitness centers, swimming pools, and dance studios. But many countries are trying to keep public services, libraries, factories, and even schools open. I almost can't believe that this is happening again, and eerily similar to before. Europe overwhelmed, drastic lockdowns that seemed to come out of nowhere. Americans looking on, thinking, at least it's not that bad here. They closed restaurants for indoor dining here in Chicago just a few days before I recorded this lesson. I have an uneasy feeling that worse is to come. Today's expression is a balancing act. You perform a balancing act when you have competing priorities and you have to strike a difficult balance between them. We often say this when your decisions can potentially have negative consequences if you don't get the balance right. European leaders have to perform a high-stakes balancing act when they design their response to this new wave of the coronavirus. Why is it a balancing act? Remember the two criteria. Number one, they have to balance between competing priorities. And number two, there can be negative consequences to not getting the balance right. So, number one, they have competing priorities. They want to control the virus, yes, but they also don't want to impose lockdowns that are too strict. They have to balance these two priorities. And number two, it's fraught with danger. That means if they get the balance wrong, there are grave consequences. Too lenient, and the virus can be devastating. Too strict, and the people could revolt against the government. When I think of a balancing act, I think of a person walking a tightrope. It's not easy to walk that tightrope. And if you lose your balance, if you don't get the balance just right, you fall off. It's often said that working parents face an impossible balancing act in the modern work world. In the workplace, we face pressure to be connected and responsive all the time, and the workday tends to expand later in the evening and into the weekends. However, parents have a responsibility to spend time at home with their kids, not distracted by work. Kids need a lot of attention too, and let's not forget about the personal needs of parents. That sounds like an impossible balancing act. You want to have a good career and advance at work, but also spend the quality time that your family wants, needs, and deserves. That's the classic definition of a balancing act, and I salute all of you working parents who perform that balancing act every day. I've been reading a lot lately about Facebook and its efforts to moderate inflammatory or untrue content on its site. Facebook also has to perform a difficult balancing act. If they allow too much inflammatory content on their site, they'll be responsible for the spread of false information, which can lead to some pretty bad outcomes, up to and including mass murder. But if they pull too much content down, they'll be accused of discriminating against certain users, and they'll lose the trust of their customers. There are many reasons to be unhappy with some of Facebook's decisions, but you can't deny that it is a balancing act. Startup companies often have to perform a balancing act between acquiring new customers and keeping existing customers happy. This is a tough one, and as the owner of an online business, I can attest to the fact that this is a balancing act. If you put all your effort and resources into attracting new customers, then you can't improve the product for your existing customers. They need some love too. Ignore your customers and you'll go out of business quickly. But if you devote all your time to making the 100% perfect product for your existing customers, then you can't grow and you'll eventually run out of money and go out of business that way. So many startup businesses have to perform this balancing act of improving the product and taking care of existing customers while also marketing to new customers. Time for the quote of the week. Has anyone ever said to you that you're wasting time by doing something you like? Watching movies or TV is a waste of time. You could be working. Cooking is a waste of time. You could just buy that sourdough bread at the store. Well, here's a perfect quote for you. Here it is. Time you enjoy wasting is not wasted time. That's by the author Martha Trolley Curtin, and it comes from a novel from the year 1911 called Frenette Married. I can't claim to have read the book, but I did enjoy that quote by one of the characters. Time you enjoy wasting is not wasted time. And that is all for today. Stay safe in Europe or wherever you are. We'll be here no matter what. Plain English is an essential service. JR and I can't do anything about the virus, but we can do our part to keep you informed and help you learn a little English during these difficult times. We'll be back again on Thursday, and the topic you're all waiting for will come next week. Probably next Monday, we'll talk about the American elections. You'll have to wait until then, but this Thursday coming up is a great lesson too. It's all about the trouble and the difficulty of buying a used car. So stick with us, join us on Thursday, and we will see you then.